Over to you.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the first of 3 webinars exploring policy options to regulate vaping in Canada. My name is Emily Taylor. I'm a research officer at OTRU, and I'll be moderating the session today. With support from Health Canada and in partnership with Physicians for Smoke-Free Canada, OTRU has completed 3 reports to address policy options in Canada. And the goal of the webinar series, the first one being today, is to provide an overview of the vaping context in Canada, to assess the evidence for a range of policy options, and discuss the feasibility of implementation in jurisdictions across Canada. For those who are able to attend all 3 webinar sessions, OTRU will provide a certificate in e-cigarette policy. Today we'll be focusing on the first of the 3 reports, looking at e-cigarette dependence in association with cigarette smoking. If you would like, and if you've not already registered, I know many have, you can register for the next session on October 5th on OTRU's website under the events page. The next session will be looking at regulatory policy for e-cigarette flavors, and the final webinar will take place on November 2nd and will focus on policies for e-cigarette marketing. I'll now introduce our 2 speakers today, Robert Schwartz and Daniel Eisenkraft Klein. Robert Schwartz is the Executive Director of the Ontario Tobacco Research Unit, Professor at the Institute of Health Policy, Management and Evaluation at the Dahlana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, and Senior Scientist at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. Dr. Schwartz is also the Director of the Strategy Design and Evaluation Initiative and of the U of T Collaborative Specialization in Public Health Policy. At OTRU, Dr. Schwartz directs research, evaluation, knowledge exchange, and capacity building programs. His current research focuses on e-cigarettes, cannabis, and strategy design. We also have our second presenter today is Daniel Eisenkraft Klein. He is currently completing his PhD at the Dahlana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. His research is situated at the intersection of political economy and public health policymaking, with a particular emphasis on commercial determinants of health and substance use. Today we also have 2 esteemed panelists joining us, Jack Boomer and Flory Doucas. Jack Boomer is the director of the Clean Air Coalition of BC and has also worked in various areas of tobacco control with an emphasis in smoke-free environments and cessation, and has worked in other areas of public health, including alcohol use. He has supported tobacco control work with various provincial government organizations across Canada. When not working in the area of tobacco control, Jack is working on various musical collaborative projects and spending time with his dog Willis. Flory Doucas is the co-director and spokesperson for the Quebec Coalition for Tobacco Control, a group known for its research and capacity to mobilize. Flory completed graduate studies in health and prevention at the University of Montreal. She has worked for over 15 years in tobacco control with groups such as the Non-Smokers' Rights Association and Physicians for Smoke-Free Canada. Flory has played key roles in campaigns to ban asbestos mining in Quebec and reduce exposure levels for workers and the public. Before moving on to the presentation, we are going to launch a quick poll for the audience. We hope the technology sticks with us here. So I'm going to launch a poll, and we would really appreciate if everyone could try to answer this in the next minute or so. What best describes your role related to e-cigarette policy regulation? Public health practitioner, advocate, policymaker, researcher, clinician, or student? Thank you for everyone answering. I see a lot of responses coming in here. Wonderful. We have a good mix today, including many public health practitioners and advocates. I'm now going to pass the floor over to Rob and Daniel for the 15-minute presentation. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emily. I've got my slides up. You should be able to see them now. And this is a joint presentation between myself and Daniel Eisenkraft Klein. We're delighted to have reached this first webinar. It's been quite a process over about 1.5 years that we've been working on these 3 reports. And we are really pleased to be able to have what we hope is going to be a bit of a conversation with you today. Because really what we would like, maybe you're looking to hear from us, we're also looking to hear from you. We really would like to hear your inputs because we're going to put forth to you 9 policy options for regulating e-cigarette products. And we'd like to know from you what you think of these and what you think the chances are of moving forward with any of these in Canada or in your particular jurisdiction in Canada. If you happen to be joining from outside of Canada, your input is also welcome. So what we're going to do, I'm going to just give a bit of introduction. Then Daniel's going to run through some of the evidence and the jurisdictional scan of what's going on with policies for regulating, for product regulation of e-cigarettes in other jurisdictions. And then it's going to come back to me. And we're going to do a bit of a policy analysis of these 9 policy options that we identified. I do want to say right from the outset that this is one of 3 webinars. And in these 3 webinars, we're going to cover different parts of e-cigarette, of potential e-cigarette policies. This particular one focuses only on the products. So the actual devices and the nicotine concentrations. Others will focus on flavors, which we've separated off. And the last one is going to be about marketing. So far, we don't have one on price, but that's obviously a very important regulatory option, and stay tuned. So to start off, if I could advance my slides, that would really help, sorry. There we go. Okay. The challenge, and this won't be new to anybody who's in tobacco control and following e-cigarettes, is that e-cigarettes do 2 things purportedly at the same time. One thing they do for non-smokers, these are young people who are non-smokers who take up e-cigarettes, they are at danger of producing a whole new generation of people who are addicted to nicotine. So the problem of addiction in of itself is enough of a problem, of an end-state problem, to cause concern. We also know that regular use of e-cigarette is likely, and every day, even this morning, there's new research coming out about the potential health effects of e-cigarettes. There were a couple of pieces today about cancer. Nothing is conclusive. But the respiratory effects of e-cigarettes are fairly well researched. So we have this problem of, oh, now my slides are advancing automatically. Let's go back to this one. There we go. We have this problem of non-smokers becoming addicted. At the same time, it is quite possible that e-cigarettes may prove to be a solution for smokers who are using combustible cigarettes, and if they were able to completely switch to e-cigarettes, then that would indeed most likely, not certainly, but almost certainly be a reduction in their harm. This would only be, of course, if they would completely switch. So that is sort of the challenge of regulatory policy for e-cigarettes. How do you strike the right balance between these 2 situations? I personally, and many researchers and policymakers and people out there in the general public, are really concerned about the first half of that challenge, which is that there has been a huge increase in the proportion of young people who are regularly using e-cigarettes. This figure is based on CS CADS. We see that from 2014-15, we have risen from 9% of kids in grades 10 to 12 all the way up to 29% using e-cigarettes in the past 30 days. Even more alarming about this is that 40% of those students who are using e-cigarettes in the past 30 days report that they are using daily. Daily use, and this was validated in an article that just came out today, daily use is a pretty good indicator of likely dependence either now or in the near future. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Daniel, who's going to go over some of the research and the jurisdictional scan.
Great, I am switching over. Hopefully you can all see that as well.
Yes.
So hi everyone, my name is Daniel Eisenkraft Klein. I'm a PhD student at Dalalana. I'm going to be going over some of the international jurisdictional scan. It's worth noting right from the bat that regulations and laws are changing all the time with e-cigarettes, especially because of the nascent nature of the product. So this is from research that we completed in August, and already things are changing, and we're continuing to look at as regulations shift. So we've identified three key but often contrasting driving principles behind e-cigarette regulations internationally. The first is upholding consumer product standards. So regulations following these principles set out production, manufacturing, and retail standards consistent with commercial product regulation common for commercial goods. And they're not meant to limit the sales of goods, but just maintain consumer trust in the products. The second focus on limiting access, addictiveness, or attractiveness of e-cigarettes by youth and non-smokers more generally. And then finally, as Rob alluded to, countries have also considered regulations that facilitate e-cigarette use for smoking cessation by adults. And these regulations are actually meant to increase sales of the product. So there are a wide range of regulatory policies that influence the likelihood of non-smokers initiating e-cigarette use and subsequently becoming dependent and or initiating cigarette smoking. We are doing 2 other talks, so we're going to speak about a number of others. Those can include sales bans, age limitations, flavor restrictions, marketing regulations. This presentation, though, focuses on those regulatory policies most directly related to development of dependence, which we've identified as sales bans, nicotine concentrations, and product regulations. So you can see some of the variability in regulations by countries here. Legality of e-cigarettes itself remains contested. According to the Global Tobacco Control e-cigarette policy scan, which is through the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins, 100 countries currently have national or federal laws regulating e-cigarettes. Among those countries, selling e-cigarettes with or without nicotine is completely banned in 29 countries, including Brazil, Argentina, and India. So I should note this map is useful for simplicity's sake, but you would need to go in depth with many of these countries to understand practice versus policy. Mexico, for example, which you can see is listed as illegal, has made e-cigarettes illegal and fully banned imports of the product. But in practice, it's widely known it's frequently not followed. If you searched on Google Maps right now for e-cigarettes in Mexico, you would see many stores continuing to operate quite openly. So there continues to be some distinctions between policy and practice. So with the exception of Belgium, that has a minimum age of purchase of 16 years old, 36 countries have e-cigarette purchasing age requirements that are equivalent to their cigarette requirements. And 13 countries have some form of taxation framework attached directly to the sale of e-cigarettes. 45 countries, including Canada, the United States, members of the EU, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand, have adopted various approaches to regulating sale of e-cigarettes, including minimum age of sale, restricting/regulating cross-border sale, and restricting venues of retailing. Manufacturers and retailers may also have to meet pre-market requirements of their products, which means that they provide mandatory annual retailer licensing fees. They have to comply with regular compliance, check inspections, and pay fines of significant amounts or penalties if they don't follow those. Out of those 45 countries mentioned that have various approaches on regulating sales, 33 countries have regulations regarding pre-marketing notification to a competent authority before introducing e-cigarettes to the market and submitting annual reports of e-cigarette sales. So that means that these can't just come out when they want to. They actually have to go through a process ahead of them. In terms of product regulations, 32 countries have prohibitions on using harmful ingredients, except nicotine, which obviously has its own harms, in e-liquids, and 33 regulate the quality of e-liquid, including safety, quality of products, and then 32 countries have regulations for child safety packaging. So besides nicotine, e-liquids may contain several additives, flavors, and chemicals which increase toxicity, addictiveness, or nicotine uptake. In this respect, countries have provided certain regulations about restricting those harmful ingredients. In Canada, for example, banned additives include amino acids, caffeine, coloring agents, essential fatty acids, probiotics, taurine, vitamins, and many of these are frequently in e-cigarette and e-liquids in other countries. And actually came as a direct response to research seeing that before that law, many in Canada did as well. And then under the EU's Tobacco Products Directive, e-liquid should not contain certain additives similar to cannabis, and should also should only use ingredients that don't pose a risk to human health in heated or unheated form. France and Iceland prohibit additives to e-cigarette products that facilitate inhalation. So that can include substances such as etheric oils that have local anesthetic effects. Those are quite common, especially in the United States right now. And they provide the capability for users to take in a lot more without feeling it, but obviously have significant adverse effects because it allows users to take in such high nicotine concentrations. And then all EU countries do meet product manufacturing standards, which means e-cigarettes need to be child resistant, tamper proof, and protected against breakage and leakage. Canada and the Philippines also don't permit the use of ingredients aside from nicotine that pose a risk to human health. Higher nicotine concentrations, as I've alluded to, and as I think is being increasingly seen, and we define higher nicotine concentrations as e-cigarettes contain at least 4% nicotine, comprise more than 75% of the e-cigarette market right now. So while the EU restricts nicotine concentrations to 2%, there are no current restrictions in the United States. And while older e-cigarettes use freebase nicotine, newer e-cigarettes, including pods and refillable systems such as Juuls, use nicotine salts, which allow for far higher nicotine concentrations. And even even in our own work, talking to Canadian youth over the past year, virtually all report using nicotine salts, and most know that that's the way that they can get much higher concentrations. So nicotine salts lower the pH of e-liquids, which allow for higher concentrations of that delivery with less irritation to the user. Currently, 35 countries across the world have regulations regarding nicotine concentration volume in e-liquids, as you can see. But the level of nicotine concentrations and volumes vary significantly. So again, in the Tobacco Products Directive in the EU, it mandates that nicotine concentration should not be more than 20 milligrams per milliliter. And e-cigarette tanks must not exceed 2 milliliters. On the other hand, Health Canada has determined the maximum concentration of nicotine allowed at 66 milligrams per gram, which is 6.6%. And it based that current limit on, quote, a peer-reviewed toxicity evaluation of the ingestion of pure nicotine. So you can see there's a significant variation of concentrations in countries, including those with regulations. And then also from an analysis of sample of e-liquids collected from South Korea, the nicotine concentrations in the product found ranged from 6.4 milligrams per milliliter all the way to 150.3. So even those where there is availability on the lower end, there's frequently quite high. And that definition of toxicity that I mentioned with Health Canada also remains contested. What is toxic versus what is actually helpful to those trying to quit. So little research, unfortunately, has been published on the effectiveness of any of the direct dependence-oriented regulatory policies. 2 studies have examined availability of different nicotine concentrations and compliance with the EU stipulations. So Gonowich et al. Found that nicotine levels in e-liquids vary widely across jurisdictions, as I mentioned. So 150.3 in South Korea was one of the highest, and then 24.7 in Poland was one of the lowest. Giravalaki et al. Reviewed compliance levels of e-cigarette liquids from the 5 top selling companies in 9 EU states. And they originally found that 87% of products in early 2016 were following actual directives, and that's increased up to 94.4% in 2018. But encouragingly, the same study found compliance with 20 milligram per milliliter limits on nicotine concentration to be 100% in 2018, up from 97%. So in the EU, at least in those 9 countries, that really was being followed. Recognizing the difficulty of regulating the inhalation of nicotine by e-cigarette users, researchers have noted the disadvantage to the directive's nicotine concentration limitation, and presumably other similar caps in other jurisdictions, highlighting the possibility of increased inhalation to compensate for that lower intake of nicotine. So in one study, for example, users who had purchased e-cigarettes that had significantly lower nicotine concentration levels consumed more e-liquid to compensate, equaling the total quantity of nicotine to that of other users that had used e-cigarettes with higher nicotine concentrations. And in some ways, this isn't surprising, but it does point to the need for not just regulation of nicotine concentration levels, but also of e-cigarette devices themselves that allow for suitable levels of nicotine exposure to users. Because if you do just reduce nicotine concentration, clearly users will find ways around that. So we don't think it's unfair to say that there is an inherent tension in policies that attempt to both restrict the availability and attractiveness of products, policies that attempt to facilitate use by segments of the population. A number of countries such as Canada, US, and South Korea, and the EU and Australia to an extent, have dual regulatory frameworks meant to distinguish between appropriate, which is defined as smoking cessation, and inappropriate, which is defined as youth e-cigarette use or non-current smoker use behaviors. But currently, there's been very limited market presence of therapeutic devices. Some countries like New Zealand have decided that vaping is less harmful than smoking, an important part of a, quote, balanced approach to help smokers quit cigarettes, which they specifically noted in their recently amended smoke-free bill. On the other hand, though youth can obtain their e-cigarettes from social sources like friends, family, and older peers who can purchase the products from retail stores, raising the bar of minimum legal age requirements that have been adopted in other jurisdictions to reduce adolescents and youth access. So we do feel e-cigarettes have the potential of causing harm among young people who are otherwise naive to tobacco products, and also reducing harm among adult cigarette smokers. The most effective strategies will and hopefully will balance both of those properties and prevent access to vaping products among adolescents and youth, and at the same time increase the availability of the regulated therapeutic products among people trying to quit smoking. We put forward that future efforts of research should focus on evaluating the impact of different regulatory policies to achieve these purposes and exploring the use of e-cigarettes as a smoking cessation aid. And then finally, national level comprehensive regulations are recommended over scattered or partial restrictions placed at the provincial or state level, and countries should be prepared for strong opposition from e-cigarette industries while enacting legislations by developing more policies that take into account evidence of both the effectiveness of e-cigarettes on curbing cigarette use and the risks of another generation that may take up a new form of tobacco use. And on that note, these are similar recommendations to cigarettes that were being made decades ago. Comprehensive regulations rather than scattered piece do tend to have the greatest effect on the objective. And with that, I'll turn it over. You can reach me for any questions or comments right here.
Thank you so much, Rob and Daniel. We're going to pause for a moment here.
Emily?
Yeah.
There's more.
I'm sorry. Back to Rob.
No problem. Thanks very much, Daniel. So Daniel's really set up and given a good assessment of what's going on around the world. What we're going to do now is go in more closely to some of the actual policies that we've identified. And again, I'm having trouble for some reason advancing my slides. There we go. Okay. Yes. Here we go. Okay, so we have identified, as I noted at the beginning of my talk, 9 policy options for product regulation of e-cigarettes. We've divided these into 3 groups. Those are those that are related to sales, those related to the e-liquids, and finally, those that are related to the devices, here called mechanisms. You can see that many of these have examples of countries that have already have these in place, and several there are no examples. So in a way, this is policy making in the dark, because the truth is, even for those policies where we do have examples, there are virtually no rigorous studies that have evaluated them and can tell us how effective they are in achieving the objectives of limiting youth access and the development of dependence, while still allowing smokers who are able to completely switch to access them. So I'm not going to go through this whole list. You can read it yourselves. I'll just highlight a couple of things. As Daniel mentioned, there are outright bans on sales in Argentina and Brazil. But there are no examples that we could find of places that allow medicinal access but no recreational access. Like, for some people, this would be the clear policy option to pursue if you want to allow access for smokers, but prevent young non-smokers from starting to use e-cigarettes. In the next grouping of e-liquid regulations, the top one, banning nicotine e-cigarettes, seems to be where almost everybody goes, exclusively, when they're thinking about product regulation for e-cigarettes. There's very little, let's go with that. There are 2 countries, as Daniel mentioned also, that prohibit nicotine salts. Those are France and Iceland. We know that in France, this is not being enforced. Not quite sure what the situation is in Iceland. But clearly, because of the role of the nicotine salts in making high nicotine concentrations palatable, this would likely be an effective policy option. Finally, in the last grouping here of actual limiting of actual regulations on the devices, we don't have any examples. But we know that high power is what allows the nicotine to be inhaled and actually absorbed, delivered properly to the respiratory system. That if you didn't have that high power, it would be very difficult to get enough nicotine in to become addicted to it. Of course, it's a combination of the power and the puff topography. So alongside limiting the heat, you may also want to have an automatic shutoff on the puff. So these are things that we can do with the technology that we have, but we don't have any examples of these. Finally, another option would be prohibiting open systems. So the tank type things where you can put in whatever you want. If you have only closed systems, you can actually regulate the device in such a way that it is low power, that the actual liquid that you put in is only of a certain type, and the length of the puff. So those are some of the policy options that we've come up with. What's going on in Canada regarding these? Well, as far as we know, and we're happy to be corrected, the only product regulation on e-cigarettes that we have in place substantially is the limits on nicotine concentration. 2 provinces, British Columbia and Nova Scotia, have completely banned the sale of high nicotine concentrations over 20 milligrams per milliliter. Ontario has an interesting policy now in place, which bans the sale of high nicotine concentration liquids in regular stores, but allows them in specialty shops, i.e. vape shops. The federal level, as Daniel mentioned, has the high level of nicotine concentration up to 66 milligrams per milliliter. What we've done now is we've assessed each of those 9 policy options along these 4 criteria. So what would be their effects on nicotine use by youth and adults? Is it technically feasible to put the policy option in place? Is it politically viable? I.e., would a political party in its right mind actually think about adopting the policy? And finally, and importantly, would it align with Canada's obligations under international treaties? So I'm not going to go through this chart for each and every one of the 9, but I've chosen 3 just to give you a taste of what this would mean. So looking at limiting nicotine concentrations, as we have in 2.5 provinces, let's say, in Canada, and as the EU has had since 2014, since 2014, we see that limiting nicotine concentration to 20 milligrams per milliliter, we think, and I'm really curious to know what others on this call think about it, we think may not have the huge effect that we might hope for. Because 20 milligrams per milliliter is still quite a high level of nicotine concentration. And with adequate power and puffing, you'd be able to get quite a bit of nicotine absorbed into your respiratory system and up to the brain. And so we wonder, actually, whether only doing that would be sufficient. In terms of the technical feasibility of this measure, again, it'll be interesting to see as these are, just being rolled out really in British Columbia, Nova Scotia. Is an illicit market developing? Is this enforceable? Is it actually possible to limit and to enforce the rule of liquids only being less than 20 milligrams per milliliter? Is it politically viable? Well, 2 provinces have done it. The EU did it quite a long time ago. And there is also public opinion poll reporting financed by Health Canada that demonstrate that there is large public support for limiting nicotine concentrations. Of course, the industry would oppose it. And we think this does align with international trade obligations, because until now, and it's been 6 years, there haven't been any challenges at the World Trade Organization on limiting to 20 milligrams per milliliter. The next example, it looks like the same chart, but we actually switched it, is about nicotine salts. So we do think that the effect of not allowing nicotine salts to be sold could be quite high, because it is the nicotine salts that make the high nicotine concentration so palatable. We think that this would face similar enforcement challenges as demonstrated in the previous slide. And the political viability of this is questionable. It is in place in 2 countries, but it doesn't look like it is being enforced. The industry would oppose this strongly. That is pretty clear. And it may be a tough sell to the public, because this is a bit of a nuanced argument. I don't think the general public is very much aware of the difference between free-base nicotine and nicotine salts. So I'm going to advance it now to the final example that I'm going to give, and this would be on that sort of regulating the device. So limiting the power, the puff length, and limiting to closed systems. We do think that this is a promising looking policy option in terms of its likely effects. If you could only allow the sale of devices that did these things, we think it could limit their attractiveness and their nicotine dependence potential. The viability and feasibility of these is questionable. I think this could be a very hard sell, considering that the other devices are out on the market. It's likely that there would it's quite possible that there would be a challenge under the international trade rules, because this would be a clear infringement on the free trade agreements that are in place. So once again, I'm just showing you this same chart that I showed you. And what I really tried to do here is to broaden our horizons. to demonstrate that the one policy option that we have in place in Canada, banning in some provinces in Canada, that is, limiting the nicotine concentrations to 20 milligrams per milliliter, may not be sufficient to reach our policy objectives. And that there is a whole range of other potential policy measures, we've gone through only a few of them here, that could be considered. And what we would like to do here and now is to hear some of your thoughts about these other possibilities. To what extent are our assessments reasonable? And to what extent is there appetite out there for stakeholders to push policymakers and for policymakers to consider these other policy options to deal with that huge increase that we have seen in the regular use of e-cigarettes by young people. And so we're going to leave it there, and we're going to do one poll now. And after the poll, we have a couple of preset questions for our panelists, for Jack and Flory. And once Flory and Jack have given their responses, we're going to open it up. We know that there have been some questions coming in the chat, and we're going to get to those as well. So Emily, over to you.
Thank you very much. We're going to move to our second polling question now. I know some have already answered, but I'll give a few moments if anyone else would like to answer the second question. If you could push for one new policy option, apart from limiting nicotine concentrations to 20 milligrams per milliliter, which would you choose? Prohibiting protonated nicotine salts, limiting the size of e-liquid refills, banning open systems, for example, tanks, and allowing only low power heat devices with automatic puff length shutoff.
Emily, have you marked that poll?
Sorry, here we go. I'll just give a moment for everyone to answer.
Did you launch the second? I think you launched the first again.
I think they're together there. So if we scroll down, we'll see the second. Thank you very much.
These are great questions in the chat.
Great. So we see a lot of interest in prohibiting protonated nicotine salts. 57 now responses in favor of that option. So thank you everyone for your participation. We're now going to turn to our panelists and ask a couple of prepared questions. Our first question, and I'll ask Flory to answer this one first, if you would. To what extent do policymakers in your jurisdiction perceive youth vaping to be a problem that requires policy attention? And to what extent is addressing this problem impeded by perceptions that e-cigarettes do more good to smokers than harm to non-smokers?
So firstly, thank you, Rob, to you and your research team. Thank you, everyone, and for inviting me to participate today. In Quebec, there has been a lot of interest and concern over youth vaping. Just before Christmas last year, the then health minister put forward a task force to come up with recommendations to deal with youth vaping. She's on the record as saying that she wanted measures to come in before the end of the year. NGOs and researchers and kind of an all-government approach was taken to this. So we understood that it would also be dealing with not just the flavors and the nicotine, but probably taxation, as is the case in the other provinces. So that was good news, but we're in September, and although I'm told a report has been tabled, but it hasn't been made public, and so we're unaware of those recommendations at this point. And the minister's also changed, although it's the same government, and so there is that governmental commitment there, but we haven't heard of anything yet, and the clock is ticking. In terms of the potential of these products and their cessation value, I think two things have really impeded a quick response from government. And one is there's a lot of lobbying going on from the vaping industry. They also contested the Quebec Act, the 2015 Quebec Act, which encompassed vaping products and had already put all kinds of restrictions on the promotion of vaping products. And the court, they won on the first ruling, so government is appealing. But of course, these are the kinds of things that the cessation argument has a lot of traction in Quebec, and so we'll see how this pans out.
Thank you, Flory. Jack, can we ask you to answer the same question?
There we go. I was on mute. One of the things in British Columbia right now is that as of tomorrow, the regulations come into effect. So there'll be restrictions on the nicotine content levels that Rob was mentioning in terms of the 20 milligrams per milliliter, and as well in terms of flavoring products and where people can buy flavored products in adult-only shops. So I think that really shows the provincial government's commitment to vaping and addressing the issue of youth vaping and trying to put in place some evidence-based or the best information that they have available to support movement on this, on vaping. I think the other thing that the regulations will prohibit is retailers from selling non-nicotine or nicotine cannabis blended vapor products as well. And so I think what they're trying to do is to make the products less attractive for youth and young adults and find a way to address this. At one point, in terms of some of the discussions, and this would have been, when e-cigarettes were coming into effect, there was a lot of discussion that I know that the Clean Air Coalition, which includes the Heart and Stroke Foundation and the Canadian Cancer Society and the Lung Association here, had some discussions with government officials, and there was this belief, and I think there still might be, that if people want to quit using or want to quit smoking, that this might be an appropriate cessation aid in that journey. So I think what they're trying to do now, potentially, and again, I can't speak on behalf of the government, but my belief is basically they're trying to put together evidence-based regulations to move forward on this. And I believe that they would be open to moving forward on other things. And one of the things I find kind of intriguing is this finding ways to prohibit certain products or additives such as the salts. And so I think that one of the things is we have these new regulations coming into effect, and I think that there will be an opportunity for movement.
Thanks so much. Rob and or Daniel, would you like to respond to the question or the comments?
No, I think that Flory and Jack have given us, two examples of what's going on in two important provinces in this country. So I think we can leave it at that for this particular question.
Wonderful. We will move to question number 2, and if we could start with you this time, Jack. How likely is it that a 20 milligram per milliliter restriction on e-liquid nicotine concentrations will resolve the problem of youth vaping?
Well, I think it's like anything into tobacco control, there needs to be a comprehensive approach, and I don't think one thing is going to address, be the silver bullet, so to speak. And so as a result of that, I think it's an important step, and I think that we have to do what was mentioned by Rob and Darren, is that we have to move forward and say what is going to happen with these regulations. How will they be monitored? How will they be enforced? And as I say, we don't have the regulations in place yet, so there needs to be appropriate enforcement, and we will be encouraging the government to enforce the regulations appropriately.
Great. Flory?
Yeah, I agree with what was said by Jack. And I think also it's important to consider that you have to start somewhere. That's just how things are. And I think the European precedent is a valuable one. The measure came into force since 2016. And although the protonated products appeared on the European market much later than they did here, they are on the market, and we did not see the type of the rapid youth spike that we've seen in North America. I mean, when Juul arrived on the market here, within months, there was already a change in the market. And so I definitely think that that's part of the solution, but as mentioned by others, we probably need to do more things as well.
Thank you. Rob and or Daniel, anything to add here?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the things that's was frustrating for us when we were doing, putting together this report is the lack of evidence from Europe. So, you know, we have some data from the UK on youth uptake, very little from the rest of Europe. And I think that, you may have a vested interest here, but, you know, Jack has mentioned it also, is that it's really important to have good evaluative studies of these measures as they come into place.
Great. Daniel, anything?
I think most of us, and I can see it in the chat too, feel we are looking for that silver bullet, because most of us care about this and feel passionate about it. We keep looking for that thing, and you know, uptake, any drug uptake, e-cigarette uptake is complicated. It's going to take a lot of things. I think that's one place for regulation. As has been discussed both by Jack and in the chat, the difference between policy and enforcement, we have lots of things that may look good on paper. And there's a conversation going on about the minimum age going up to 21. Grade 10 to 12 are all under 18. For them, it's illegal as well. And both from uptake, because we see that they're vaping, and from interviews and focus groups that Rob and our team have been doing, it's just not being enforced. All of them know where to go. Convenience stores, you know, we could talk about which policies to put in place or enforcement actions, but convenience stores have decided, a lot of them, that it's worth it to still sell to them. The risks are not strong enough. And then online, virtually all of them know how to get it online. So some of it is law, some of it is regulations, and some of it is actually looking at how those regulations are followed up on.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to save at least 10 minutes for questions from the audience, but we have a third question for Jack and Flory here. Flory, if we could start with you this time, that'd be great. So thinking of the context with and without COVID, what is or what would have been the political appetite for adapting any of the other policy options that we have presented today? And if you could choose one to push for, which one would it be?
So it's hard to say. As you know, COVID has affected Quebec considerably, and it's posing definite challenges here. I think that, you know, what has been mentioned, and certainly what the coalition was advocating, is a hybrid model of both sales regulations and e-liquid regulations. I think it's important to note that in terms of sale regulations, most countries do allow for the marketing or the commercialization of medicinal products. The thing is that manufacturers have not bothered to go through that process, and often it's because the market is just maybe not conducive to that. So I think that what we're looking for is allowing for e-liquids to be, whether it's, you know, over 20 milligrams per milliliter, but also in terms of the flavors and maybe the packaging, quite different if they were sold as medicinal products and if they got that approval, that certification as medicine. But for recreational products or uncertified products, then we are looking to both regulate the e-liquids and all those other aspects that I think will be part of the next webinar. So I think it's a mixed model, and that's probably what Jack was referring to when he was mentioning about a comprehensive approach.
Thank you so much. Jack.
Well, first of all, I need to apologize to Daniel because I called him Darren, and so you might think that might be his brother, but Daniel, apologies. You know, we're excited in British Columbia because we have these new regulations coming into effect tomorrow, and so we need to see what will those hold in terms of moving forward. If there would have been one wish list, it would have been to completely ban flavorings, because flavorings will be allowed in adult-only venues. But again, we are looking forward to some enforcement there. In terms of moving forward, you know, I have to say that I'm going to keep my comments brief, because this whole debate about age 21, I absolutely love that debate, and it's something that we are doing a lot of talking about and would like to push a little bit further. But again, it's for me and for us, it's complicated by the whole fact of cannabis and what you do about cannabis, where the age is 19 right now. But if there was one thing that we would push for, if we had the resources to do that, probably it would be about the salts that I mentioned earlier. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. Rob, Daniel, anything to add here?
I'd like to hear from the audience in general. And unlike Daniel, who's able to do two things at once and monitor the chat, I'm a little less adept. So I don't know, Emily, if anything's been popping up for you that you want to raise for discussion from the chat that's been going on.
So we have a few questions. Some were submitted ahead of time by some particularly keen audience members, and thank you to everyone who's participating in the chat right now. And I'll just pose some questions and we'll see how many we can get through. And I will ask Rob to help me to direct traffic to Flory or Jack or Daniel to see who's best placed to answer this. So this first question is, do nicotine vaping devices perform any better than other forms of NRT in helping smokers to quit?
So I can take a crack at that. One of the British studies on RCT that came out about a year ago demonstrated that e-cigarettes were a bit more effective than NRT. But in both cases, they were accompanied by counseling. And so, like, overall, if you look at most of the clinical trials that have been done, they're at about the same level as NRT. But the big potential advantage of e-cigarettes would be that they would be attractive to hundreds of thousands or millions of smokers, because they're cool and they look nice and they've got the same hand-to-mouth motion. And so that is sort of the argument that is made. And we do know, actually, now that e-cigarettes are the most popular way by which smokers try to quit. So there is a potential opportunity here. Are they, like, at an individual level more effective? I don't think we can say that now. Yeah, I'll leave it there. And others may want to address that as well.
If not, I'll move to our second question here.
Can I mention one thing?
Of course.
That the excitement for this is in part driven by industry, because they have now suddenly been inspired to want Canada to unsmoke and to stop smoking. So part of this is also that the move to e-cigarettes as an exciting proposition is industry pushed in a way that NRT, though they have involvement in it, or counseling, which really doesn't have as much vested interest from industry, that those just don't have. So e-cigarettes have taken on this excitement that, and we'll talk about marketing in our next webinar, but that have been marketed by e-cigarette companies. Whereas other, and lots of money is going to evidence finding for whether e-cigarettes can actually do that in ways that lots of other very good therapies that don't have the same financial backing have been unable to muster.
I just want to add, in terms of just some of the data from the UK, I think that there's evidence there to show that the nicotine cap of 20 milligrams per milliliter hasn't impeded the ability or the potential of those products to be used for cessation among smokers. And so in and of itself, I think there's good reason to think that a regulation such as that one won't thwart the potential or the capacity of smokers to resort to those products when they want them to quit smoking.
Just quickly, I mean, indeed, the RCTs that have been done on the effectiveness of smoking cessation have almost all been done with nicotine concentrations far less than 20 milligrams per milliliters, and those they're showing that even at the lower levels, they are effective for some people at least.
Great. Unless anyone has anything else to add, I'll try to squeeze in one more question here before we wrap up. How many people are using vaping products to quit versus the number of either dual users and or recreational vapers or underage youth users?
I can take first crack at that one as well. The CTAB's data, I think it was 2017-18, I don't have an updated version of this, shows that fully 65% of e-cigarette users are also smokers. Okay, it means that the vast majority of people who use e-cigarettes are dual users. Only 15% were former smokers. Okay, and the rest were all never smokers. Okay, so it does show that some people, yeah, were smokers and now they're not smokers, so they either quit by vaping or they had quit smoking altogether and started to vape. Okay, but it shows that really, potentially alarming situation of some 2/3 who are dual users. Now you might say, well, the dual users are on their way to stopping smoking. That's great. If that is the case, then bless them, and bless e-cigarettes. I'm not an anti-vapor, so to speak. If they can help smokers, then absolutely. But at the same time, we see that huge uptake by non-smokers. So that's.
Wonderful. We have about 2 minutes left. If Jack or Flory or Daniel would like to add anything here.
I'll add something very quick. I've been involved with a lot of cessation work, and I think it's been one of those things that doing cessation, many people in the community, or at least that I can speak to, are really afraid of e-cigarettes and that they're one step away from the devil. And I think that one of the things we may need to reconsider in the tobacco control movement is e-cigarettes are here. How could we use them to effectively help people? As Rob just quoted, 65% of smokers are dual users. So we may need to rethink of how to use them in the cessation continuum to really actively assist people and set up a shop where you want your patch gum or your e-cigarette, and then we will help you with that. Because we need to just say that I think e-cigarettes are here to stay.
Okay, thank you, Jack. We are just about at time here, but I just want to thank everybody so much for attending today's webinar. Many, many thanks to our presenters, Rob and Daniel, and to our panelists, Jack and Flory, for the discussion and for the lively chat from the audience. There's a lot for us to read and process and learn from in this chat, so thank you so much for those contributions. We really hope to see you at the next webinar series, which will be on Monday, October 5th from 12 to 1, and we will be discussing regulatory policies for e-cigarette flavors. You can register for the series at our website, otru.org, under our events page. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day, everyone.